Welcome to the Dr. DigiPol show. I am Alan Rosenblatt, your host, aka Dr. DigiPol. We have a great show for you today. It's a bit of a disturbing topic. It's hate on the rise. We're going to be talking about the rise of hate crimes and related in America. My guest today is Dr. Paul Leighton, who is a professor at Eastern Michigan University, criminology, criminal justice, and sociology. He is co-author of the book Class, Race, Gender, and Crime, also co-author of the book The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison. Paul has dedicated his professional career to studying the impact of just all aspects of crime, but has looked at the rise of evil in society. I remember his dissertation days when he was looking at the witch hunt and the banality of evil, a la Hannah Arendt. And I'm really happy to have Paul here. Been trying to get him on the show for a while. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
It is certainly my pleasure, and I wish we could be talking about something a little more exciting, maybe rebuilding VW minibuses, but instead we're talking about the rise of hate crime in America and potentially elsewhere. I've been looking at some of the hate crime stats, and preliminary data on the data from 2016 shows that New York City has indicated a 24% increase in hate crimes, which is the highest in over a decade. New York State has had a 20% increase. Chicago has had a 24% increase. Cincinnati, Ohio has had a jump of 38%. Columbus, Ohio, 10%. And close to my home, Montgomery County, Maryland, 42%. These are disturbing numbers, and how well they'll translate, how much they'll drive the national numbers is yet to be determined, but we certainly have seen some increases in the last few months, haven't we?
Yeah, and the reality is probably worse than that because the FBI only gets a really small segment of what's going on. The hate crimes part of the FBI data is all voluntary. So law enforcement opts in to doing extra paperwork to report all of that, and a lot of law enforcement agencies don't bother. So if you look at Mississippi for 2015, you see that they reported no hate crimes at all. There are lots of other large areas of the country that just don't bother. They report very selectively certain categories of hate crime. So that's why organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League, kind of give us another good picture of that because they're looking at media incidents, people who are reporting stuff to them that they try to verify. So that also tells us that there's a lot going on out there, especially on college campuses as well.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it's become a lot. I want to get into sort of the history of this, but let's start with just a quick, what's your gut reaction? To what degree do you think the Trump rhetoric has been enabling this recent rise in hate crimes?
It makes sense to me that there's a lot of linkage there. He's been retweeting a lot of stuff from white nationalist organizations. There's a graphic that he retweeted, among many other things, trying to claim that something like 90% of whites were killed by blacks, 81% of whites were killed by blacks. There have been a number of other things that have come directly from kind of white nationalist Twitter accounts that have ended up on Trump's Twitter. And if you're part of that community, you see that. Lots of mainstream folks who don't know the background of it may or may not feel completely empowered by him. But there's certainly a segment that knows where he's coming from, knows where all that material is coming from, and that there's a deeper ideological connection with him. And I think we've also done ourselves a disservice by talking about tolerance rather than respect and a deeper level of engagement with people's dignity. If you're tolerated and the mood changes, then people are no longer tolerant of you. Working to build tolerance is just kind of a very minimal standard here in society. And I think that that's what we're seeing now. but there are lots of individuals who feel empowered by Trump. There's a lot of anecdotal accounts of people even just kind of saying, boy, that was good to say, after they spit out something kind of racist or telling people to go back home, even though they were born in the country.
Yeah. Well, I know that I've, since since Trump's campaign, not since his victory, but during the primaries, I was trolled by Trump train activists, and it very quickly got anti-Semitic, and I was called a kike, and ironically, I reported it to Twitter as being, I was, this was hate speech, and Twitter at the time reported back to me and said this does not satisfy our requirements for hate speech, which I hope that they've changed that, but that was particularly disturbing for me since that's about as bad a thing as you can call a Jewish person.
Yeah,
So,
no, I'm sorry to
uh,
hear that that happened.
let's go back. Yeah, well, I had an email that was snared in the DNC WikiLeaks email hack. I guess the Russian hack of the DNC and WikiLeaks tweeted out a snapshot of my email to the DNC. Very benign email talking about some silly hashtags. I was talking about how I had created a hashtag called Trumpster diving, and Republicans holding their nose and voting for Trump as they dive into the Trumpster. But so not really important, yet it rose to the level where I was getting tweeted at, called on my phone, emailed. My work phone was being harassed. It was a couple weeks of annoyance for sure. So let's go a little deeper here, because the roots of anti-Semitism, the roots of racism, the roots of hate crimes goes back some time in this country. Obviously it goes back way back in the world, but let's talk. Tell us a little bit about some of the sort of the rise in the modern era of these bigotry in this country.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, just quickly in response to your experience, the biggest category of religious hate crimes that the FBI reports is anti-Semitic. That's half of that category. So this is a
Really?
lot of what's out there, even while a lot of the anti-immigrant stuff is big and deserves a lot of attention as well. Yeah, I see what Trump is doing kind of fitting into the classic narrative. You tell people that they are special, that they deserve more than they're getting, which is always a popular message. You blame some kind of an out group, you scapegoat them, you set up policies to do something about that, and people cheer you on, but you miss a lot of the bigger picture. Um, so I kind of came into this during the 1980s and early 1990s when things like the Turner Diaries was still popular. It was being traded extensively on the gun show circuit. This was kind of some of the material that McVeigh read and apparently slept with under his pillow. This was published in late
Right.
1970s by William McDonald, and it tells the story of Earl Turner, who is kind of a nice, slightly awkward, klutzy, well-meaning guy who starts to step up his participation in the order, challenging the Zionist-occupied government. And it follows him through his recruitment and his radicalization as he starts to kind of get deeper in and starts to kill people, starts to participate in mass slaughters. The order actually sets off nuclear war in the United States and other countries, trying to reclaim part of it as white. So there's a nuclear attack on Detroit to wipe out kind of black majority cities. And at the last pages of the book, Earl Turner flies a crop dusting plane with a nuclear warhead attached to it into the Pentagon. So for lots of folks, this was kind of the required reading, the shock against the system, which was seen to be so corrupt. And now again, I think we have a slightly different take on it, but I think a lot of the big picture about what people see as the problem is still there.
Yeah, it's very just it's certainly a very disturbing book. I remember I taught a course on politics and propaganda, and actually had an assignment where they read the Celestine Prophecy at the beginning of the semester and the Turner Diaries at the end of the semester. And they use very similar logic. I wanted them to write a comparison of the rhetorical persuasive techniques. And they both sort of start with very easy to accept premises. Celestine Prophecy is no such thing as coincidence being the first premise. And I think it escapes me what the initial premise of the Turner Diaries was, but it wasn't. It was not a difficult one for people to accept. And then throughout the story, they sort of build premise after premise after premise in sort of a Confucian model of if this, then that, then that, then that, then that, then that. And logically, it's not a very good, sound structure for demonstrating truth, as they say with Confucian logic. The truth trees never close, which is a logic reference to the structure of the argument. But both of them lead to rather incredibly outlandish final premises, final conclusions. And as you say in the Turner Diaries, it culminates in this nuclear equipped crop duster crashing into the Pentagon, and that's a pretty intense set of ideas. Now, in the process of this book is written in 1978, and obviously there's a range of things that happened with regard to hate crime. But in the late 90s, a man named Milton John Clem writes on behalf of the White Aryan Resistance War, which is one of these organizations, an essay about how to use Usenet, the original social network, basically bulletin boards pre-web, all text-based, as a way for tactics and strategy for using Usenet to disseminate Nazi propaganda or white supremacist propaganda, for refuting the opposition, and for really recruiting people. Tell us a little bit about these early days of using the web that you came across back then.
Yeah, that was pretty fascinating to see how organized and thoughtful they were about those recruitment efforts. A lot of that document talks about kind of finding people who are isolated, finding people who are loners, trying to befriend them, trying to talk about self-esteem, and find links with them kind of as people first, and then you add in the ideology. Obviously, if they went to certain Usenet groups in particular to try to find people, they also used heavily their own Usenet groups also, and people in there. But this was kind of early organization that fed into a lot of other message boards. Stormfront now has kind of become just a big message board and place to go. I know that in the cybercrime world, the hackers have a lot of forums where you can only get in by kind of personal introduction by somebody who's already a member. I'm assuming that there's a lot of that going on out there as well, so that a lot of these tactics continue. A lot of people can use non-public forums to trade things how they really feel, even if a lot of their other public comments are a little bit more sedate. And this also fed into some other efforts, like Resistance Records, trying to put out some white nationalist music and bands, trying to make a really big go of it in college radio stations, that this was alternative music that folks were kind of being politically correct about. But anywhere that there was kind of a station that branded itself as alternative, they would try to win them over, trying to do festivals, trying to use attractive blonde women who are part of white nationalism to help recruit guys to come aboard and show them the, kind of what was available to them if they joined the movement.
So, I mean, what you're describing sounds like your ordinary car show. Alternative radio sounds like your ordinary punk rock, or new wave radio show. Those seem rather mainstream. What's can you go a little deeper into the linkages between that and some of these white supremacist movements?
Um, so I think that in lots of ways they helped pioneer a lot of tactics for the internet before a lot of people thought about it. Um, there were a lot of people kind of in the leadership who were very thoughtful about the future and feeling like since they were crowded out of a lot of the traditional spaces to spread their message, to talk openly, you kind of get involved in the internet early and colonize the space and try to bring other people along. And I think a lot of those tactics now seem kind of obvious, but at the time they were really breakthrough, and there was a lot of very cutting edge stuff that a lot of the white nationalists were doing. And I think we see that in the continuation of Cambridge Analytica and other things. There's always been a very tech savvy, very forward thinking contingent there. And I say that carefully, not to always kind of make the opposition seem more powerful than they are, but I think we also need to be careful about kind of writing them off as a bunch of Nazi thugs and punks who, kind of drool on themselves and just stand around shouting slogans.
Right. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot to cause disruption. You mentioned some of the sort of the invite only platforms where some of these conversations taking place, but Stormfront being one that's a bit more public. There are two other increasingly prominent places where things have been taking place in terms of the conversation. One is this relatively new social network called Gab.ai. Gab.ai, where a lot of literally hundreds of thousands, if not a million or so, of the people who were suspended off of Twitter for being, for promoting hate speech have aggregated and gathered. And the other is in the comments sections on Breitbart's website. There tends to be a lot of conversation going on there, and I should note that we'll bring him up shortly. But Nick Lowles, who is the director of Hope Not Hate out of the UK, has joined us, and we're very excited. We were unsure if he was going to arrive in time because of his flight, but he's here. And so once we wrap up with talking with you, Paul, we're going to bring him on, and he's got a really interesting report on Breitbart's forays into Europe, which really sort of take this issue with regard to hate crime and hate on the rise as not just an American thing. It certainly seems to be a global thing, and there seems to be very common actors driving it from behind. Um, when what should people? I mean, how should people feel about this? I mean, people are out there, and some people are worried, of course. I mean, certainly if you're a person of color, certainly if you're a Muslim, certainly if you're a Jew, there seems to be a good cause and good concern to be afraid. Just what? How should people be reacting to all of this?
Ah, that's kind of the $1 million question. Um, what should you do in the face of a lot of this, and what is effective? Certainly, there's kind of wars, hashtag wars going on in Twitter, and everyone is trying to colonize everybody else's hashtags. So when you go and search for it, you don't come up with what you're expecting. I think a lot of the action still is kind of out in people's communities. What do you do when you see racist leaflets on college campuses, or hear people kind of talking openly about Muslim bans and other things, or Mexican criminals, or kind of passing on some of the outlandish fake stats that Trump seems to keep mining and throwing out there. Um, we do seem to know that correcting it isn't the only answer, but it seems to be an important place to start. We know from lots of experience that it tends to be silence that emboldens people. If they don't hear any resistance, they think that they're right and that everyone agrees with them, even if they don't. Obviously, a lot of the bystander intervention talks about this, and certainly if you feel safe trying to make a comment, at least saying you don't agree with that and you think the perspective is wrong, even if you don't want to get into a larger conversation about it, you can just kind of say, I don't agree, but we don't have to talk about it right now. That kind of helps set the stage. Obviously, if people can do more, trying to counter some of the rhetoric, some of the seeming momentum that a lot of the alt-right and the white nationalists have. All of that is appreciated. Organizing demonstrations, other types of resistance, it's all important to keep at the power. We know that power never concedes anything, and in silence, power tends to get its way.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because going back to the tactics that Clem wrote about in 1999, or 98 actually. It's if you kind of think it through, he says always make sure your message is out there, counter any opposing messages, recruit people that seem to be potential supporters offline or by email, off thread, and he also makes a point of the way you talk within groups and communities of your own is different from the way you talk out in the public. And when you talk out in the public, they say he's recommending don't use the words related to racism or race. Keep that out of there. And so this gives rise. Well, a couple things. One, the technique of get your message out there, always counter information and recruit people. I mean, it's what Al Qaeda has used. It's what ISIS has been using on social media, but it's also what all organizers use, regardless of whether it's online or offline. And the difference is whether you're using it for good or bad. But the important thing I think is that in the messaging is that there's a very deliberate effort here that when they're in when the right wing, when the far, the alt right, the white nationalists, the white supremacists, when they're out there in the mainstream engaging in conversation and disseminating information and recruiting people, they're not using the obvious buzzwords. They're hiding in some ways their message. So you mentioned briefly about Trump throwing out some of these stats that come from very challenged sources or very disreputable sources. Talk a little bit more about the kind of the code language that gets used in disseminating this information without revealing it as explicit.
Yeah, from my own field, one of the big things that the conservatives started to do as far back as kind of the Johnson era was to start to talk about law and order. And that was the kind of dog whistle at the time for a lot of racists. We're kind of in the Vietnam War, we have Civil War demonstrations. So law and order really signaled to everyone without saying lock up the blacks or repress blacks that this is what we're after. Let's put them in jail because they are criminal. It kind of feeds that very nicely. At the same time, the law and order reminds people that there is an existing social order and that we are going to reinforce that. And I think that Trump's tough on crime is a harken back to that, even though we had kind of a nice momentum for criminal justice reform for a little while, that now has stopped. And there seems to be an awful lot of discussion about law and order. It seems like the task force is stocked with lots of law enforcement agencies that the Attorney General is convening. So I think we'll get something that's very pro-police, that comes out very law and order, that will criminalize a lot of dissent in the same way. Other than that, we don't have Trump really talking exactly about what made America great in the first place. He's never really been held account to that question. So everyone is kind of allowed to think about it on their own. And for lots of people, that was a time of much more blatant racism. We didn't have to worry about a black president, other blacks in positions of power. We didn't have as many women around in public spaces. And again, kind of CEOs and folks with lots of money So I think in lots of ways, the kind of Make America Great Again is a nice harking back to a time when power was a lot more white and male without actually saying that.
So you're seeing Trump talk about law and order. I'm your law and order candidate. This Make America Great Again, harking back to this. We're already seeing Attorney General Sessions rolling back a lot of enforcement of civil rights. Pulling back directives with regard to transgender rights, to civil rights. Arizona, uh, the House passed a bill. I'm not sure what the current status of it, where basically if you organized or participate in a protest and there ends up being property damage as a result of it, that your own assets can be seized. And in one of the Dakotas, they passed a law that if a protester is in the road and you hit them with your car, you are not responsible. So we're seeing a lot of really interesting and powerful, really disturbing examples of what you've said. It seems to be happening.
And the criminal justice task force that Sessions is getting together, they're very upfront about the fact that they see Black Lives Matter as the problem. They don't say Black Lives Matter is the problem, but they have been talking about how because of protests and bad media coverage, there's a disrespect towards cops that's creating all of this crime. So they are basically blaming Black Lives Matter for increases in crime in different ways. So again, they don't kind of come out and say we're against Black Lives Matter, but the whole agenda is right there. And by buying into all of the rhetoric, you are buying into something that is definitely race-based.
Yeah, I mean the Black Lives Matter issue is particularly upsetting because here's an organization or really a grassroots movement that rose up because of the disproportionate likelihood that African Americans are going to get shot in encounters with the police, and somehow they've been accused by Trump supporters of being the racists here because somehow Black Lives Matter is elevating them above everybody else, when the whole point is that in principle all lives matter, but in reality Black lives in practice don't seem to matter as much, and we need to fix that. And it's just amazing how the language gets flipped around. It gets repeated over and over and over again. I was struck by Clem in his list of his bullet points of what to say in this essay that we were talking about. Has one bullet point here which says, remember, our overall Usenet strategy must be to repeat powerful themes over and over and over. And then he continues on this paragraph. The next bullet point is, remember, our overall Usenet strategy must be to repeat powerful themes over and over and over. And it's exactly the same paragraph. He actually says it twice on two separate bullet points to make the point. Now, that's a joke I use often in class where repetition increases stickiness, repetition increases stickiness. But, this idea of you start to say it over and over again. The president says it. His spokespeople say it. Breitbart says it. The Wall Street Journal says it. The New York Daily Post says it. Fox News says it. Pretty soon, everybody's saying it, and it takes on a truth of its own, or as Colbert labeled it, truthiness. Right? It has the feel of truth, even if it isn't. And this is really it's in a, and so hand in hand with this rise in hate is this assault on knowledge, this assault on truth, and it increases the ability to say, oh, those stats about the increase in hate crimes, they're fake, and yet people are still suffering from those attacks.
Yeah, we all look for the things that confirm what we believe anyways, right? That's not just right. That seems to be something that people overall do. And I think Trump has really mastered kind of playing this, trying to get people to go outside of mainstream media, connect with him directly, trying to plug the, Breitbart and other things in some of his interviews so that people will go there for truth.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm gonna bring Nick up to talk about Breitbart since we started to talk about that. But if at any point you've got something you want to add, you can raise your hand, use the button to raise your hand, and that'll alert me that you got something to say, and I can bring you back on cam. But thank you, Paul, for this. This has been really, really helpful, and hopefully we can bring you back up, and you'll have more to say as we move forward. So with that, I am going to bring Nick up for a moment, and for a little bit, and introduce him. This is Nick Lowles. Welcome, Nick. Nick is
Hi.
from London. Are you actually from London, or your office is in London?
Yep. Yeah, I'm from London.
Yep. And Nick is the director of Hope Not Hate, which is a research and advocacy organization focused on identifying not just elements of hate, but really trying to offer a message of hope, how to combat it. So I asked Paul a little bit about how people should be responding to this, but that's really at the center of the work that you're doing, isn't it?
That's right, and I kind of think that there's a twin track strategy. There's one about watching and exposing hate, but at the same time, it's trying to organise communities around a more hopeful message. And I think, particularly at this time where it's so easy to be anti, it's important that we develop a positive message around positive values.
So the idea. So let's back up a little bit and start with tell us a little bit about Hope Not Hate, and then let's talk a little bit about your Breitbart report.
Sure. Well, I started Hope Not Hate formally in 2004. I've been very active in kind of anti-fascism before that, involved in an organisation quite similar to the Southern Poverty Law Centre, which mainly did research. We did undercover work, we exposed the activities of violent groups. In the kind of mid 2000s, there was a kind of rise of far right party in the UK. And openly kind of, led by a man who was openly Nazi, denied the Holocaust, thought um, Hitler was great. And despite that, his party was getting 30–40% of the vote in some white working class communities. So myself and a few others started to kind of get together and say, look, anti-racism clearly isn't working. Our strategy in those days was about having demonstrations and being in the town centres or city centres, and yet these kind of far right groups were going into communities, spreading lies, tapping into resentment and everything. And so, we felt that we had to change our strategy. And we had to not only counterpose their message of hate with a kind of positive message of hope, but also to engage in those communities and on those issues that the far right were kind of trying to exploit. So really, that's how we started. We've got a kind of supporter base of about 250,000 now in the UK. We operate our elections, try to stop far right parties winning elections, but we also do work in the communities, trying to find ways to bring divided communities together and find kind of these kind of shared identities and highlighting what people have in common rather than just always highlighting what kind of divides us.
Yeah, the temptation to always go after, how bad they are. It's really strong. I mean, I fight it every day, and I don't always succeed in trying not to only say bad things about Donald Trump, but and what he's doing. I try to say some good things and some engaging things, but the temptation's very hard. What kind of reaction are you getting from people? Are they engaging on the levels that you're recommending?
Well, I mean, certainly whether it's Brexit in the UK, and that was obviously the vote last summer for Britain to leave the EU, or Trump's election in the US. I mean, it's kind of a lot of people angry. It's energized a lot of people. I think our concern is that if it's just about protest, after a while, people are going to start to get bored and tired, and and start dropping out. I think what's also important, and whether it's organisations like ourselves or other organisations, we've got to start with strategies to go forward. Not only be against what Trump's doing, but actually trying to kind of unite people around a vision and values that he doesn't stand for, and create a pathway to how we can turn this around. I kind of feel that I mean, certainly in the UK, there were lots of kind of anti-Trump demonstrations, especially around the inauguration day. But it's kind of, and people felt good about going on those demonstrations, but as the days and weeks have gone by, all that fades away, and I think we really need to capture this anger now and channel it into a really positive and productive way.
Yeah, I think that's very strong and good advice. Let's talk a little bit about Breitbart. So Breitbart has become really front and center here in the United States. Very actively involved in really becoming a platform for the alt-right, as a place for news has been wrapped up in the dissemination of a lot of the early, a lot of the right-wing fake news. And its publisher, Steve Bannon, has become basically the top advisor to the president, to Donald Trump. And but there's a lot more to Breitbart than just what we see here in the United States. And you have a new report out. Here, I think I can show a picture of it, although I don't have a color copy of it. Breitbart, a right-wing plot to shape Europe's future. And this is that bigger picture that I mentioned earlier in the broadcast. I think a few minutes before you arrived, that there is this. It's not just about the United States. There is this really systematic attack against Western civilization, and it seems like Breitbart is pulling the strings. Tell us about the report.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Breitbart has been in the UK since 2014, and I think, to be honest, we all took our eye off the ball. It was this crazy little website that pushed out crazy little stories, exaggerated stuff, became kind of hysterical in attacking its opponents. And really, it's only when we started looking into it, following kind of Trump's election and stuff, we actually found that it was far more organized and far more systematic, and more importantly, kind of really thought out its process of operating. And I think that obviously the kind of main far right politician in the UK now is a man called Nigel Farage, who I think most people in the US, or at least political activists, will probably have heard of now. He has really been shaped by the Breitbart agenda. Up until 2013, 2014, he really didn't talk about anything other than getting Britain to pull out of the EU, to separate, us from the kind of rest of Europe. He kind of met the Breitbart people during that period. He met Robert Mercer. He met Bannon. Breitbart opened up in the UK, and Nigel Farage's politics started to change. The Breitbart operation, as Steve Bannon has now admitted, they set up in the UK to directly influence elections and help people like Farage win in 2015. And as we looked into it more, we find that both Breitbart itself, but Breitbart's part of a wider kind of right-wing nexus of organisations under the control of Bannon and Spencer, had a quite influential role in the vote last year to kind of pull the UK out. Cambridge Analytica, all these kind of little kind of instruments and tools that these people have were kind of put at the disposal. So I think for us, the more we look at Breitbart, the more we see it. It's a political operation, and I think we have to be careful rather than just dismissing it as a bit of a crazy, nutty right-wing news operation. It what it does quite calculated, and it's part of a thought out political plan. And I think to understand Breitbart's intervention in the UK, and now that they're talking about expanding into France and Germany, all you have to do is look at Bannon's political thought and his idea about the clash of civilizations, his idea about Europe being weak and liberal democracy and secularism having to be swept aside. This is the Breitbart agenda.
So I know that when we first met, I raised the question of Russia's role in all of this, because on the one hand, it seems that Russia and Breitbart had some similar goals, but it seems to me that I'm not necessarily getting the sense that Breitbart is all about building a pro-Russian West, but he's looking to, in some ways, remake the West into a new or a throwback to sort of an older day. What is that dynamic there? What is Bannon's and Breitbart's vision for Europe if they're successful at breaking down the current regime?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at or listen to Bannon's speech that he did to a kind of right-wing Catholic conference in 2014, he explains his kind of vision of the world and how Europe is the kind of front line. He thinks that Europe is too weak to deal with the threats it's facing, and by that he means Islam. He and people around him believe that there's this clash of civilizations. The West and Islam are going to go to war. It's going to be in Europe, and that liberal democracy and secularism has made and kind of social democratic parties has made Western Europe too weak to fight that. And I think what's interesting, I mean, if you kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, liberal democracy is probably under threat in Europe like it never has been before. After World War II, the horrors of World War II created this kind of post-war consensus between, conservative, centre-right and centre-left party. They will do politics different in the future. They won't go to war. They'll try to deal with problems. They'll try to look after people, humanitarianism, human rights, equality legislation, all these kind of the pillars of liberal democracy, which have lasted for 60 years. Those are under threat from four different elements, really. You've got kind of Bannon and Trump in the US. It's mainly, obviously, Bannon in the US. You've got the rise of far-right populist parties in Western Europe. You've got the rise of the kind of authoritarian regimes in Central and Eastern Europe. And what was quite interesting, literally the day after Trump got elected in November, many of these countries, Poland, Romania, Hungary, started bringing in quite kind of draconian laws, abolishing the kind of the independence of the judges, for example, in Poland, because they didn't feel the pressure from Western Europe anymore. So that's the third element, and the fourth element is obviously kind of Putin and Russia. All very different political strands, but the one thing they all share in common is the weakness of Western Europe and the kind of that there's this liberal democracy and liberalism that has to be destroyed for each of them to achieve their goals. And I think that so from Hope Not Hate is an anti-racist organisation, but we see the struggle that we're in now is far, far deeper. Many of the things that we've all grown up with, we've taken for granted, collectivism, humanitarianism, all these things are under threat now from these kind of forces, both from within and from without. And what's quite interesting about Bannon and Russia is that one of the, I mean, there's kind of growing evidence about Russia's role in trying to influence far-right politics or anti-gay campaigns in Western Europe and Central Europe and everything. But you've also got some kind of fascist Russian parties and Russian kind of leaders who have kind of one foot in the Kremlin and one foot out. The most prominent amongst them is a man called Alexander Dugin, and he was the man who brokered the agreement between Russia and Turkey after the Turkish Air Force shot down the Russian jet. Now Bannon describes Dugin as Putin's Rasputin. Dugin praises Bannon and says that Trump's White House is something that Russia can do business with. Dugan is a couple of weeks ago was on Alex Jones's InfoWars. So there's a kind of blurring of kind of political traditions going on now, and part of that is that the one thing that they really do share in common is this belief that liberalism has to be swept aside.
So, what is? What's the timetable? Yeah. Well, actually, the timetable. I guess we have the elections coming up in Germany and France, but I want to come back a little bit to some of the themes. When I started the show, we were talking with Paul. A lot of the hate crimes that we're seeing is, Paul indicated, more than half of them that are reported in the United States are anti-Semitic hate crimes. There certainly is this Black Lives Matter, which is, basically hate crime, or just it'd be probably controversial to call hate crime, but there certainly is this prejudicial treatment by the police of black men, especially black women, and they're more likely to get shot in those situations. But the way you describe Breitbart's agenda and Bannon's agenda, it's all focused on anti-Islam. But at the same time, it seems to be enabling allies that are bigger, have more enemies than just Islam.
Yeah, and they kind of clearly have a wider agenda, but I think that certainly in terms of what's motivating Bannon and Europe and his vision about Europe, and likewise, if you think about, like Breitbart in London, hosts many of the kind of it's London Breitbart that hosts many of the kind of main anti-Muslim activists, Pam Gellers and stuff like this on Breitbart. It's via the London Breitbart pages. There is this kind of conventional belief in this kind of new right, that there is going to be there is going to be some sort of kind of clash. There is going to be some war. There's an incompatibility between Islam and kind of Western Christianity, and that Europe is the battleground for this. And I think that it's quite interesting how you've seen whether it's Breitbart and others go after Sweden, for example, and obviously it's been in the news recently with what Trump said. But traditionally, Sweden for a very long time has been the kind of model liberal democracy, very relaxed, very open, and everything. And so there's been a political project to undermine that, to talk that story down. Likewise, for example, Germany. To a certain extent, Angela Merkel is the kind of main politician now holding the line of liberal democracy. She comes from the centre right, but most people in Europe, are now looking to Germany as the kind of as the last line. And whereas obviously with the stuff going up in France and all these other countries, and so again, it is no fluke that Breitbart has been deliberately talking up these stories about these mass sexual assaults and these attacks on churches, which get found out to be complete nonsense. But it's a deliberate act to undermine the credibility. And I think that it is really important that when we look at Breitbart, when we look at what's trying to do, even in what seems to be the daftest thing, there is a reason why it is doing it, and obviously it doesn't operate in a complete kind of vacuum. And if you look at the kind of what we call the kind of so-called counter-jihad movement, that's obviously how they self-describe themselves, the kind of Pamela Gellers and Frank Gaffneys and stuff. Again, it's all this worldview that there is this clash of civilization, and then that battle is going to happen in Europe. And I think that Trump has surrounded himself with all sorts of kind of extremists and mad people or whatever. But the really dangerous one, in our view, and I think everyone's view, is Steve Bannon, because he has a mission, and he has a mission. I say this as someone who lives in Europe. He has a mission which is obviously far more international than kind of some of the others that Trump has appointed. And I think out of all of them, Bannon has his own agenda. And he will use Trump as he can. But as we've seen with the referendum campaign last summer in the EU, they've got other tools at their disposal, and Robert Mercer and all these shadowy figures who put in millions and millions into both Breitbart, but other companies like Cambridge Analytica to try to influence public opinion, to try to mobilize people around emotion, to try to kind of distort the political debate, or even just to keep people busy. We're always on the defensive. We're always trying to justify why their stories are lies and everything. But in the process, we're doing part of their job for them because we keep talking about them. Let's say Sweden, for example. Trump says something stupid, people push back, the Swedish government push back, but it just means that for 3-4 days, the world's media in the US and Europe is all talking about Sweden and multiculturalism and rape and kind of all the rest of it. So even I think that the tricky thing for us is that we've got to push back against these people, and we've got to expose their lies, but we've also got to find a way that we're not just keeping the story rolling on for days upon days.
So we have to pivot to the right message. You've mentioned the Mercers a couple of times, Rebecca and Robert. Can you tell us a little bit more about who they are?
Well, they are extremely wealthy people who've obviously funded a range of organisations and political causes. I mean, they supported Ted Cruz to begin with in the GOP presidential nomination contest, and they switched their allegiance over to Trump at around the same time that kind of Bannon went to work for Trump. And I think the figure is, I mean, you'll probably know more than me, but I think the figure is that they put 13 million into the Trump $13 million into the Trump campaign. So it was like one of the largest single donors. They've also put 10 million into Breitbart, but then they've clearly got a range of other kind of right-wing outfits and companies that Bannon sat on the board of some of them and everything, and there's clearly there's a small group of other people as well who I'm kind of I'm not sure if we know all the characters, but these are the kind of really, I think, kind of influential people who are kind of playing a game of chess, moving things around the board. So it's not just Bannon. I mean, there's been a lot of focus about Bannon himself over, certainly in the UK, like probably more so in the US. But I think that he's clearly plugged into this network, who is known for years, and they're all part of this kind of project.
Well, I think the most important thing that I want to leave our audience with, and that you really focus on, is if you could talk a little bit about what is that message of hope? How do you message against all of this in a way that is hopeful rather than just highlighting the hate?
Sure. I mean, I think um, a number of things has to happen. I mean, I think that we have to kind of regroup. Whether it's in the UK or US, in a way, we've both been on the losing side over the past year. We have to regroup. We have to look at really be honest and reflective about what's gone wrong. We need to reassert our views and mobilize people around values in the world that we want to live in. But then also, we've also got to do the work to kind of reach out into communities because Trump didn't appear from nowhere. Farage's the Brexit success didn't appear from nowhere. It was obviously clearly a growing alienation in certain communities, feeling that they've been ignored, feeling that they've no one's listening to them, and they're struggling with globalization and everything else. And I think that we have to reconnect. And I think that while it's good to do the value thing is really important and offer an alternative. We also have to think about how we engage on a one-to-one level in these communities, how we talk to people and how we bring them over. But also fundamentally, we need our politicians and our academics and economists and stuff to say, how do we create a kind of global economy that works for communities that clearly hasn't been working for over the last 15, 20 years.
Well, this has been really helpful. I think I'm going to bring Paul up for a final comment. I think he had a comment about hope versus cynicism. But thank you very much, Nick. If you have more to say in response to what Paul says, just send me a text and I'll bring you back on the screen. But thank you so much for really rushing to the to where you are now from the airport so that you could be on here. I really appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to bring Paul back up for a quick comment. And so, Paul, you've heard some of the things that Nick has been saying, and it dovetailed very nicely with what you were saying before. But you had a comment with regard to hope versus cynicism.
Yeah, maybe this is actually kind of a comment Nick could respond to. I was taken with Colbert at some point, who kind of said the problem with the Obama type hope is that at some point it turns into cynicism when what happens doesn't arrive. But fear is really kind of limitless. You can keep mining it. People will stay scared a lot longer than they'll stay hopeful. So how do you kind of take that reality and turn that into an enduring message?
Well, let's bring Nick. I'm going to bring you back up for see if you can answer that. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, good question. I think what's important is that hope can't be just some bland slogan or some bland wording or value. It has to mean something, and I think that I think what it is important is that it's a way of mobilizing people, and particularly our people and people who are nervous and worried about what's going on in the world now. And I think that it's a way to gather people around. However, that, as you say, that hope doesn't mean anything if it's not backed up by a real offer to people who feel that they're losing out. And I think that it has to go alongside an economic message, a social message, a kind of that actually really means something. I think we're living in such cynical times now, and also we all know in the kind of modern media age where people kind of engage in news and everything in just a few seconds, either hysterical kind of right-wing noises are often far more favorable to kind of more nuanced positions. But I kind of think you need the two. You need the hope, you need the rallying cry, but also you kind of need the policies to show people that there can be a real difference.
I really appreciate that, because it really highlights the importance that hope is not just an empty word, but has to be backed up by realism, by practical plans, and by a dedication to follow through. So we have our work cut out for us, and I really want to thank you. If you want to read, I'm gonna wrap the show up here. Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks, Paul, for joining us. If you want to read the report from Hope Not Hate, you can go to hopenothate.org.uk in order to download the report. It's there, and by all means, sign up for their email list and all of that. If you are living in the Michigan area and you want to take a course with Paul Leighton, he's at Eastern Michigan University. Maybe you want to take a course there. You should check out a couple of books by him. As I mentioned, he has the book. I'm losing the title here. Class, Race, Gender, and Crime, but also he is the co-author of the book The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, which is a fantastic book that I read back when I was an undergrad, and that Paul became the co-author of in several of the latest editions. So co-author with Jeffrey Ryman. But there's been a lot of interesting discussion here today. I think it's really important that we focus on what Nick says about coming up with a hopeful message. It's not enough just to say bad, bad, bad. You have to say here's an alternative that's good, 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 and we need to be able to back that up. So that means that whatever you do in opposition to the rise of hate in our society, it has to be more than just lip service. And it's not just about messaging. It's about real policies that have real impact and good messaging to promote them, so that people know that what's being done is in the best interest of everybody. And I honestly believe, and this is a theme that you've heard from me over and over again, is that you have to listen. You have to listen to the people in order to figure out what are their pressure points, what are they upset about, what's frustrating them, so that when you formulate policy and when you formulate the message of hope, that it is responsive to what really is at the core of what people are having trouble with or what they're struggling with. Otherwise, it just goes nowhere. So with that, this has been another episode of the Dr. DigiPol show, and we will be back again, and I hope you can tune in again. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and do a little head bopping on the way out. Take care, and bye-bye.